In 1915, a young Mahatma Gandhi arrived in India. He was stepping onto the subcontinent 30 years after the organized nationalist movement had already begun. The preceding 3 decades were highly volatile. A generation of leaders had already built the intellectual and political architecture that Gandhi would eventually inherit. We can map the foundation of modern Indian politics across this specific 8-node timeline. Tracing this sequence reveals the mechanics of how polite constitutional petitions evolved into a mass demand for absolute self-rule. Node 1. Bombay, December 1885. This is the first gathering of the Indian National Congress. The safety valve theory suggests the British engineered the Congress to vent rising Indian dissent through a controlled, harmless channel. But Indian nationalists counter this with the lightning conductor theory. Early nationalist leaders knew a purely Indian political organization would face immediate imperial suppression. They deliberately used Hume's British status to ground the movement and protect it from the state. This institutional approach secured a minor early victory with the 1892 Indian Councils Act, which granted Indians limited political representation. Whether intended as an imperial trap or a nationalist tool, the 1885 Congress successfully built an all-India political platform for the first time. The first 2 decades of the Congress are known as the moderate phase. They strictly adhered to drafting petitions, submitting prayers, and exhausting constitutional methods. But their soft political tactics masked a devastating intellectual contribution, spearheaded by Dadabhai Naoroji. This flow diagram illustrates the core thesis of his groundbreaking work, the drain theory. Naoroji mapped exactly how colonial administrative costs, exorbitant military spending, and forced exports systematically siphoned wealth out of the subcontinent directly into the British economy. The moderates weaponized this economic data to dismantle the pervasive myth of British benevolence. The Indian intelligentsia stopped viewing colonial rule with gratitude. The data proved the institutions were instruments of economic parasitism. While the moderates refused to break the law, their rigorous economic analysis provided the explosive intellectual ammunition needed for the radical protests that followed. The breaking point arrived in 1905. Viceroy Lord Curzon unilaterally dictated the partition of Bengal. The British claimed the massive province needed to be split for administrative convenience. Their strategic intent was obvious: fracture the strongest hub of Indian nationalism along religious lines. The public backlash was immediate and unprecedented. It sparked the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi targeted British economic interests directly through the absolute boycott of foreign goods. The song Vande Mataram emerged, serving as the unifying battle cry for the resistance. This mobilization bypassed elite committee rooms. Massive segments of the population poured into the streets in open physical defiance. The 1905 partition proved to a new generation that polite petitions failed against imperial decrees. It forced a permanent shift toward radical mass action. The momentum of the Swadeshi movement forced the Congress to escalate its demands at the 1906 Calcutta session. They adopted 4 radical new objectives: Swaraj, or self-rule, Swadeshi, the boycott of foreign goods, and national education. An extremist faction within the Congress, led by the Lal Bal Paul triumvirate, pushed for aggressive implementation of these pillars across all of India. Tilak drove a shift in political philosophy. He stopped requesting colonial concessions and demanded inherent rights. Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it. The friction between the cautious moderates and the radical extremists climaxed at the 1907 Surat split. The Congress was physically and ideologically fractured. The nationalist movement was now ideologically fierce, but institutionally shattered, leaving it completely exposed to British legislative countermeasures. The British had already prepared a counter-strategy. Back in 1906, they actively cultivated a parallel political entity, the All India Muslim League in Dhaka. The calculus was precise: empower a separate religious political identity to act as a permanent bulwark against the Hindu-dominated Congress and the swelling Swadeshi protests. In 1909, they executed this strategy legally through the Morley-Minto reforms. Look at this map. The 1909 Act introduced its most destructive mechanism: separate electorates. By legally segregating voting blocks by religion, The British ensured that unified, cross-community political action became structurally impossible. By 1909, the British had engineered a deeply divided opposition. They stoked a fractured Congress on one side and legally partitioned the broader populace on the other. Despite the legislative manipulation, the relentless economic pressure of the Swadeshi movement finally forced the British to annul the Bengal Partition in 1911. But in the exact same breath, they executed an imperial countermove, shifting the capital away from volatile Calcutta to the historic center of Delhi. Meanwhile, the heavy state suppression of the extremists forced radical dissent underground, giving rise to violent revolutionary networks like Abhinav Bharath in Maharashtra. Then, in 1914, World War I forced Britain to reevaluate its resource priorities, putting sudden strain on the colonial administration's ability to maintain total control. This is the exact environment Gandhi stepped into when he landed at the Apollo Bunder in 1915, a sophisticated, radicalized, and deeply fractured political matrix. Let's recap the sequence. 1885, the Congress is institutionalized. 1892, limited representation via the Councils Act, the catalyst. 1905, the partition of Bengal. 1906, the formation of the Muslim League and the push for Swaraj, the fracture. 1907, the Surat split. 1909, the Morley-Minto suppression, the culmination. 1911, the capital shifts to Delhi. 1915, Gandhi arrives. This specific sequence, from economic critique to mass action and legislative division, defined the political landscape Gandhi inherited.